Okay, so taking a look at the counterculture of the 1960s and 1970s. As we've seen with the administration of John F. Kennedy and then Lyndon B. Johnson, and as we will talk about Nixon, Ford, and Carter, the 1960s and 1970s were a turbulent time and a changing time in American history. With our introduction and focus on the Vietnam War and the controversies behind that, the concern about the credibility gap between the American administration and the presidency and the information towards the media to the American people are going to have people starting to question the social norms that had started to be established in the 1950s. And so the counterculture movement builds off the civil rights movement. Many other minority groups are going to be inspired by the actions of the civil rights movement, and also people starting to break against those social customs that had become so ingrained in society in the 1950s. So that sense of conformity is also going to be challenged. So we're going to look at some of the groups that are going to be inspired by the civil rights movement and some groups that are going to look to break that sense of conformity that was established in the 1950s. The first group that we're going to take a look at is the role of Native Americans. In the 1950s, there was a survey conducted by the Eisenhower administration over the growing concern of the death toll amongst Native American populations. So it was starting to see that they had an extremely high unemployment rate. They were considered some of the poorest American citizens in the United States at the time. And also the Native American infants were nearly twice, their death rate was nearly twice the national average, compared to others during the baby boom. And so this created some concern in the Eisenhower administration. And he came up with what he called the termination policy. Now, don't be misled by the term termination. It wasn't to eliminate Native Americans, but it was to try to help Native Americans relocate from their isolated reservations into the more modern, updated urban and suburban areas of the United States. Problem is the plan failed miserably. Most who moved to the cities still remained extremely poor because a lot of the resources within the cities were starting to leave to go to the suburbs. So they went from one rural poor situation to an urban poor situation. So many Native Americans across the country started to try to organize. They thought if they could organize their powers and leadership, they could confront the United States government about the numerous broken treaties that the U.S. government had made with their tribes and trying to regain some of their ancestral land and burial grounds back to be able to govern themselves. And this became known as the National Congress of American Indians. So started the foundation in 1944, so just before the end of World War II, but really starts to take hold in the 1950s to combat against Eisenhower's termination policy because it just wasn't working for them. They wanted to be able to choose their own way of life. They wanted the United States government to honor the treaties that had been broken in the past. And they wanted to be able to, kind of govern themselves and live their way and their culture had expected them to be able to. So there is going to be some progress. By the late 1960s, President Johnson is going to create the National Council on Indian Opportunity so that he could start to try to help alleviate some of the problems that the Native Americans were having, started to honor some of their land treaties, and give them more of an ability to govern themselves. But as we've seen with other generations in the 1950s, the younger generation, particularly with the example of the Civil Rights Movement, they're not as patient. They want change and they want it to happen more quickly. And this is not any different amongst the Native American population. And so the American Indian Movement, or AIM, is going to be founded by that younger generation. They were largely a self-defense organization or self-defense group against police brutality, so some of the discrimination that they were still facing. But it also started to branch out of protecting rights of the large Native American populations within the northern and western states of the United States. They helped protest, advocating for Native American interests, and they were also supported, other interests of other groups. So while it was mostly in the north and in the western part of the United States, they're going to really support really any Native American group. And AIM is not only going to be against the American government, they're also going to clash with their own tribal leadership because they feel the tribal leadership is not pushing enough for change. So from 1969 to 1971, many members of like AIM and these other Native American organizations start to occupy territories. They start to either take back some of their native lands, or in this case here, Native American activists tried to occupy the island of Alcatraz. So Alcatraz was a federal penitentiary that was closed by this time. They were hoping to make this island kind of their center, okay, their organizing factor for their efforts, kind of a central location for tribal groups to be able to come to organize to discuss issues with the federal government. One of the things that the AIM movement is most well known for is their Wounded Knee occupation. So in the winter of 1973, members of AIM went to Wounded Knee, which of course is the last armed conflict between Native Americans and the U.S. government. And so this is where the U.S. government and army decimated the Native American tribes to the point that they no longer resisted occupation of their land. And so the Sioux in particular were members of Wounded Knee. Prior to Wounded Knee is when Sitting Bull had been killed by U.S. troops. So the Sioux here, again, the Oglala Sioux were part of the group of AIM that were occupying Wounded Knee. And so this is where they demonstrated, they kind of took a siege of the town. They did take hostages, so this wasn't a peaceful takeover. They did take hostages within the city, but they ultimately lived life as their tribe had saw it, so by cultural tradition, they'd had their cultural ceremonies. So during their time of occupation, there was a birth, there was a marriage, there was, mourning of death. And so they had, for the first time in a long time, the sense of being able to live their lives, practice their culture without any type of American government interference. But it is going to be a tense situation. The FBI was trying to retake hold of the city, and so there was gunfire between the members of AIM and FBI. That's where the 2 deaths came in. 2 Native Americans were killed and many others were wounded. It was 71 days for the siege, but eventually the FBI was able to overtake the city. They arrested over 1,200 people, or nearly 1,200 people, but despite this takeover, this did get the U.S. government to start thinking about trying to work with the Native American tribes and promised to re-examine Native American treaty rights from treaties back in the 1800s to try to help them reestablish some power in regards to land. So these are some pictures of that occupation. So they did have protests, they did have signs, they were armed, but again, within the Wounded Knee community, there was more peaceful in the means where they did not have a government influence telling them how to live or what to do. Okay, another group that's going to be inspired by the civil rights movement and starting to strive for power was the Latin American population. Thinking about Latinos in the United States in the 1950s and the 1960s and 70s, vast majority of Latinos were of Mexican descent. Many Mexican Americans lived in the southwestern part of the United States, California, Arizona, New Mexico. Many members there were descendants of the Mexican citizens who lived in that land when it was part of Mexico, and when the land was transferred to the United States, they never left. Some had immigrated, some were vaqueros who came during World War II for temporary job opportunities and harvesting crops, and many of them did stay. In the 1960s, close to 500,000 Mexicans are going to immigrate to the United States searching for better jobs. But another growing population, were Puerto Ricans. We had almost 1 million Puerto Ricans in the United States by the 1960s because of our occupation or our annexing of Puerto Rico from the Spanish-American War in 1898. Many Cuban refugees, so in the southeast, particularly Florida and Miami, we're going to have a large Cuban population start to grow, seeking refuge from Castro's regime and the communist takeover in Cuba. So with this growing Latin American population came a desire for more rights. They were heavily discriminated against. They were discriminated in hiring processes and housing, where they could live. So we started to see a lot of segregated housing places, Spanish-speaking neighborhoods, because they wanted to create a sense of community and protection for themselves. They were also nearly 50% at a higher unemployment rate than that of whites and other minority groups within the United States. So this is something that they wanted to challenge, particularly in California, where the United Farm Workers are going to start to organize. So Cesar Chavez was an Arizona-born Chicano. A Chicano is typically a male of Mexican descent, and he felt the best way to bring about better working conditions for many of the Mexican American migrant workers within California who worked on the farms was to unionize. And so this is where the United Farm Workers was organized in 1965. Many Chicanos worked, very hard, laborious jobs, backbreaking work, and were paid very little and had little to no benefits beyond that limited pay. And so they were organizing to get better benefits and higher wages. So the United Farm Workers had two goals. One was first get their union recognized. They didn't want to necessarily go on strike, but they wanted their union recognized. They wanted to be able to negotiate and talk to the members of the large farms and organization there in California for better working conditions and pay. But the second was increased wages and benefits. And so Cesar Chavez, took a note out of Martin Luther King's and Gandhi's book of nonviolence. He says, we're not going to be violent. We're not going to destroy property or destroy the crops. But what we will do is we will call for a boycott. And so he organized a nationwide boycott of California grapes, so like table grapes and raisins and grape products, to try to hit the farm owners where it hurt, in their pocket. Okay, so cut their funding. He himself also took a note from Alice Paul in the suffrage movement. He went on a hunger strike. So because he was, kind of the forefront of the movement, he was getting a lot of media attention, another key element from the civil rights movement. He was getting a lot of media attention for his hunger strike. And in 3 weeks' time, he lost 35 pounds, which was a huge drop and a very noticeable drop that it did start to call for people to take action. And many citizens did participate nationwide in the boycott of California grapes. And so it brought the farmers to the negotiation table, and they were able to get them higher wages and better benefits for the migrant workers. So this just kind of showed the continued practice that nonviolent protests could be effective in the United States. And so this is Cesar Chavez. Another minority group that was struggling for recognition and equal rights in the United States was the LGBT community in the United States in the 1950s. Understanding, American culture in the 1950s, LGBT members could not be out in American society in the 1950s and the 1960s. This is still a time period where this was against the law to be a homosexual. Americans were imprisoned, so you could be arrested and imprisoned for homosexual practices. But a lot of times, many people still consider this to be a psychiatric issue. And so many people were committed to psychiatric institutions. They were subjected to electroshock therapy. Some people were lobotomized, where part of their brain was removed for violating state laws and for violating what was considered acceptable social norms in American society. So in the 1950s, many LGBT Americans kind of kept their gender identity or sexual orientation a secret, because disclosing this information could have meant losing their jobs, they could have lost their homes, or even essentially their freedom, being arrested and or really the ability to control their own body. Many of those who were unable to live, kind of quote, in the closet, or to live that quiet life, or chose not to. Some people started to push back against the, social reaction, and they faced tremendous persecution, though. Oftentimes, many in the conservative community and conservative environment, especially during the Cold War, considered members of the LGBT community to be anti-American. They were even seen as a communist threat, that communists were putting these individuals here to break up American society. So thousands of gay and lesbian armed service members were fired, government employees were fired or pressured to resign. And so this was, many people kind of put this under the Red Scare, but also many historians have started to call this, quote, the Lavender Scare. So, fear of the LGBT community. So in June of 1969, we this was not an unusual incident, but this incident did have an unusual end. There were many sanctuaries in major cities throughout the United States. The Castro in San Francisco and the Greenwich Village in New York were these kind of havens for members of the LGBT community. And with that, they had bars and restaurants and, kind of community-owned and organized forms of entertainment and socialization for the LGBT community. And one such place was the Stonewall Inn. So this was in Greenwich Village, and this was actually owned by the mafia. Okay, so the Stonewall, kind of, again, was that kind of central place there in New York City. It was a sizable community in Greenwich Village, and it was kind of the city center for the counterculture movement as a whole. So on the evening of June 27, 1969, police officers raided the Stonewall Inn. And again, this is not unusual. There are oftentimes police harassment to the LGBT community, and you could be arrested just for simply going into the Stonewall Inn because it was known as a gay bar. And so if you were there, it was believed that you were a member of the LGBT community. And so in this case, the raid was not unusual. The police have been harassing gay bars and homosexual men and women for years. But what was a shift, instead of dispersing quietly, which many people would, during a raid, many patrons of the inn or restaurants would just simply leave. They'd try to go someplace else. They try to get away before being arrested. But they didn't. In this particular instance in 1969, many of the gay onlookers stopped and actually started to taunt the police. They started to shout back. They started to throw things and start to attack the police. Someone even tried to set a blaze to the Stonewall Inn because the police had barricaded themselves inside. They were armed. And so this was an instance where they were no longer going to take this harassment. They were going to start to fight back. And even though arrests were made, during that riot, many people continued to riot. They started to attack police in other locations within Greenwich Village. And so they started to, challenge what was happening here. And this is considered to be the beginning of the gay liberation movement. The Stonewall riots kind of gave that inspiration to others. After the riots, there was a tremendous growth in the LGBT community and organizations. They started to create groups and organizations, groups for lesbian women, groups for homosexual men. They created transgender groups, and in other cities besides New York City, we started to see a big following in San Francisco and Chicago and Los Angeles as well. And on the 1-year anniversary of the Stonewall riot, they actually held marches. They had a march in New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Chicago. And that was the beginning of the gay pride marches that are held annually in cities throughout the world today. And so under the Obama administration, the Stonewall Inn is actually now marked as a national landmark for the beginning of the gay liberation movement. And so these are some pictures of the riots that took place there. And again, this is just some more information in regards to the impact that the gay liberation movement has had. There's still going to be struggles, but many people start to push for, kind of coming out of the closet, not living a secret life, living your life openly, and starting to make that become part of the social norm in American society. And so, of course, they are going to be met with resistance, and there are going to be other, factors of discrimination. It's not going to be an easy process, but in the 60s and 70s, there was this sense of freedom that many felt, which we will see some negative impact, particularly on the loosening of sexual morals amongst the LGBT community with the discovery of AIDS. In the 1970s and early 1980s, doctors started to see cases of AIDS come up, and they started to see it primarily in the homosexual community, particularly amongst men. And so at the time, doctors were still trying to diagnose what were the symptoms, what were the causes, but this created a great stigma against the LGBT community because they felt that AIDS was started out of as a homosexual disease, making Americans fear homosexuality and wanting to create laws to discriminate and to eliminate that from American society. It took great effort by organizers in the LGBT community to get President Reagan to actually acknowledge it instead of grids, to actually call it AIDS and make it aware that it was not something unique only to the homosexual community, but also to any citizen, any person could contract AIDS. But it was going to take a great deal of effort to get the federal government to acknowledge that. Another component of the counterculture was the rise of feminism and the women's movement from the 1950s into the 1960s. So as we saw, in 1950s culture, women were, told that to make make their life, happy was to find a husband, raise their children, and to keep their home. And Betty Friedan had been part of that generation. She was college educated. She went to Smith College, and she, had what was the picturesque life. She had a loving husband. She had very healthy children. She had a house in the suburbs. But she, and like many other women, found themselves saying, is this it? Is this all that my life is to have? And so she started to conduct a survey. She actually went back to some of her graduates from Smith College 15 years after graduation, and she found she wasn't alone. She found that many women felt trapped in this suburban lifestyle, that, this everyday routine of sending their husband off to work, taking their children to school, grocery shopping, endless housework, and kind of thinking, is this all that I have? And so this inspired her to write The Feminine Mystique, which was a book that proved the fundamental to, kind of became the Bible really to the women's movement, where she talked about the interviews and the psychological impacts that the 1950s had had on women and how they felt limited and that they wanted more. And so this was kind of the birth of the feminist movement, which the feminist movement is where women should have economic, political, and social equality with men. The feminist belief, the role of feminism wasn't something unique to the 1950s and Betty Friedan. They just revived it. The feminist movement, started in the late 1800s, mid 1800s, when women started to pursue the right to vote. Once they attained the right to vote in the 1920s, they kind of saw the feminist movement start to go into decline. But there was this reawakening in the 1960s. The government also started to take in information. The Kennedy administration started to take a poll in 1961 to see, what was the discrimination practices against women in the hiring process. In 1963, they reported that women were paid far less than men, even when they were doing the exact same job as men. Also, women were seldom promoted to management positions, regardless of their level of education or experience or ability, and they were put into what were considered stereotypical women's jobs. They were never considered for what would be, quote, a man's job. And so this is going to really inspire women. The other thing that inspired a younger generation to really start to activate and pursue equal rights for women was actually the anti-war movement of Vietnam and even the civil rights movement. Many members of SNCC or SDS, when they were organizing these protests, whether it was against the role in Vietnam or the discrimination towards African Americans, women who would try to take a lead in a protest or organize them were often put to a side. It was very much dominated by men, the organization process, and when women had ideas or pushed for more equality within those movements, they were often kind of brushed to the side. And so they thought, here we are trying to strive for equality, or here we're trying to make political change, yet there's still a hierarchy within these organizations that are supposed to be, culturally progressive and changing. And so that's also going to inspire many young women, which created the National Organization for Women. So this was to support full equality for women in America, truly equal partnership with men. It became to symbolize the feminist movement. And there were both male and female members to now. Gloria Steinem, she's going to become a spokesperson for women's rights. She wrote many articles and lectures. She even created a magazine called Miss, which created articles written by women, kind of, pushing some of the feminist agenda for their readers. But she was also leading protests as well. For example, during the Miss America pageant in 1968, she encouraged women to, they threw bras, they threw girdles and wigs and other, quote, women's garbage into freedom trash cans. So this is the era of when women started to burn their bras. She, Gloria Steinem, even dressed up a pig and marched it around as Miss America to condemn the practice of what Miss America at the time objectified in regards to women. And so she kind of became, more of this active kind of figure even on TV in regards to the feminist movement to start to push back. And so one positive in regards to the National Women's Organization, or now, is Sandra Day O'Connor. Many women took this as a great victory when in 1981 she was appointed as the first woman Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court and will become the first female Supreme Court Justice. And that was under the Reagan administration. So just looking at some pictures here, this is Betty Friedan. So she's the author of Feminism, kind of, again, the Bible of the feminist movement. This is a cover. There are multiple covers to it now. That's just the original. This is Gloria Steinem. So she's the one who led, kind of more of the maybe controversial campaign. She's the one who dressed up a pig for the Miss America pageant. Symbol there for the National Organization for Women, and Sandra Day O'Connor, so the first female Supreme Court Justice. Some of the laws that are going to come about because of the feminist movement. There's Title 12, which prohibited discrimination on, Title 7, prohibited discrimination on the basis of gender, religion, and national origin. So starting to recognize women to be equal partners in American society. There was also the Equal Pay Act, so stemming from the investigation done by the Kennedy administration, started to try to address the pay discrepancy for women and try to get them more equal pay, which of course is still an issue in American society today. But probably one of the biggest items of controversy that still has not been passed is the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA bill. To this day, there is not a constitutional amendment declaring the equality of women to men in American society. This Equal Rights Amendment was proposed. This was pushed back in the 1920s after women got the right to vote. So it was first proposed by Alice Paul and some of the other leading suffragists. So they not only wanted an amendment to vote, but they wanted an amendment that would guarantee them equality in American society. But it never got passed. Congress, the amendment got passed the House of Representatives, but it failed for ratification, so states would not vote on it to actually put it into force. They never got the state numbers. And so we keep seeing the ERA bill come up. It came up in the 80s and 90s, and even in recent elections, trying to get this amendment passed. It's become a major rallying point for the women's movement and continued rallying point today. There are going to be members who do criticize the feminist movement. There are those who criticize because they felt with the ERA bill it would lead to problems that women are not recognizing. For example, drafting of women. As they're pushing this in the 1970s, this is also the era of the Vietnam War with the draft. And so many critics of the feminist movement, which is led by women, said, this is going to draft women into the war. It would be the end of laws protecting homemakers. So women who choose to stay at home to raise their family, they felt there would be an end to the husband's responsibility to provide for his family. So especially, if a family were to be divorced, the male's responsibility to provide for his children. And at this time, they also feared that it would lead to same-sex marriage, which, as we know, is still a highly debated issue. Another component that will be thrown in with the ERA bill was the Roe versus Wade ruling that took place in 1973, where the Supreme Court ruled that women do have the right to choose an abortion during the first 3 months of pregnancy. And so Roe versus Wade kind of got pushed in with the feminist movement, and that also sparked many people to go against the feminist movement for those who were anti-abortion. And as we know, the issue of abortion is still a controversial issue to this day. Okay, the last one that we're going to take a look at here is the role of hippies. So in the 1960s, we see the hippie movement and hippie culture emerge. It was kind of a build off of the beat movement from the 1950s. So during this, this is a young generation who wanted to break away from the conformities of the 1950s and the early 1960s that society had kind of put out as social norms. They rejected that standard American customs, social customs, and even political views. They were seen as kind of unkept individuals because of their long hair. Many people created campaigns, Make America Beautiful Again, cut a hippie's hair. They saw that their ragged dress as a disrespect to American culture and American society because they wore, ragged jeans, or they wore tie-dye at the time, or they wore love beads or military garments, or Native American ornaments. I mean, it was kind of a hodgepodge of clothing that went against the very strict suit, gray suit, white button-up shirt, tie, that had been of the 1950s and 60s, in the early 60s. So they were marking against. They also practiced, communal living, so they didn't have, private ownership, so everyone contributed together, they lived together. This is a practice of free love, the use of marijuana and LSD, or known as acid, to free one's mind. And so this is like the era of Woodstock. This became a great congregation of hippies, and they would listen to music and be inspired by it. Although it's usually opposed to the involvement of American soldiers in Vietnam, this was not a political protest. It's kind of happening simultaneously. There are members of the hippie community who are members of the anti-war movement, but they are not all in the same. Not all anti-war movement members are hippies, and not all hippies are anti-war people. This was more of a cultural protest or a cultural change or shift than a political one. San Francisco became the hub for the hippies, kind of became hippie capital within California. So many people who said, they would hitchhike to get to San Francisco to live in that communal type of setting. But by the 1970s, the hippie lifestyle is going to start to come to an end, because they start to realize that while they could kind of live this communal life and live this sense of freedom, they could not agree upon who's going to do the cooking, who's going to wash the dishes, who's going to pay the bills. They just thought these things would just naturally come without organization, and that was not the case. And so by the 1970s, really thousands of hippies started to line up at government offices to try to collect welfare or food stamps, to try to get themselves back into a routine of that of society. And they became dependent on the very society that they were trying to reject against. So the hippie movement is not necessarily going to be successful for all, but this is the traditional view that many people saw. This is an image of Woodstock. So this is Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, were some of the key musicians for the hippie movement. And unfortunately, both Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix are going to die of drug overdoses, as many in the hippie community did, particularly off of LSD or acid. They had a bad trip, and many people had accidents or committed suicide while under those hallucinogenic substances.